I'll take your question first, actually. A movement is not an organization by definition. That doesn't mean that an organization isn't part of a movement. It would be, the way I think of it, would be, here's a movement, and here may be some really important organizations that are part of it. And those organizations may be working in coalition and actually exerting some significant influence, but ultimately, and if you call a boycott, it's not like everyone in Montgomery, Alabama, who in 1955 was choosing not to ride buses, was part of an organization. In Egypt and Tahrir, of course, the same thing. So there was something broader in terms of the voluntary participation of thousands or millions that was bigger than any one organization. But can an organization be firmly within a movement? Yes. Can an organization play a very active role in trying to build movement capacity and also serve the function of helping to guide, to educate people about strategy so that the catharsis actually channels somewhere? Yes.
But does that mean that the movement cannot be organized?
No.
It should be organized.
It should be organized, absolutely.
Why can we not call it an organization?
Well, I guess I would say it's not, for example, what you would think of as a normal NGO, non-governmental organization that has a clear charter and funding and this and that necessarily.
Hierarchy, structures, and a way to communicate instructions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so different movements some will be more hierarchical and some will be more decentralized and they all have elements of both in them. And in, for example, a movement that's in a highly repressive context may need to be decentralized, but if it later comes to a point where it needs to negotiate, it may need to centralize because it may need someone to represent them. So that's very context dependent, I would argue. Yeah. Okay, two other questions and then I'll go on.
Can I add something to this?
I think I really must go on because we are already halfway through the session. But can I come back to you after I go through a few more slides? Great. In terms of how formal a coalition is as an MOU, it totally depends. It totally depends on the context. In some places, of course, the organizations don't even formally exist, and so and so it could be very loose, or it could be very formalized.
Clandestine.
Yes, it could be clandestine. And then charismatic leadership. There are different kinds of leaders in movements. Some might be extremely skilled local organizers who may never make the front pages of anything. Some may be very skilled at framing the issue nationally or internationally. Some may be very good at strategizing. And so I would say, when I look at a movement, I look at leaderships, not necessarily one kind of leadership. Okay, got to keep going. So some major cases of civil resistance, which I will run through as quickly as I can. We tend to think of Gandhi as one early example. And I think if we understand Gandhi, we understand a lot about civil resistance. There's no question about it in terms of the contribution that he and his movement has made to our understanding. But there are so many other cases, and I will actually focus on my own country for a few minutes. This here is something called the Boston Tea Party. And when I learned about the U.S. War of Independence, I never learned about 10 years of nonviolent action, of civil resistance against British control before any violence broke out, but that's actually what happened. There was refusal to pay British taxes. There was refusal to buy British goods. There was dumping of British tea into Boston Harbor, not far from here. There was refusing to obey British laws, refusing to go to British courts. At the same time that there was the building of alternative institutions, alternative economic institutions in at that point, the colonies, the building of alternative dispute resolution systems, so you didn't have to go to a British court, you could go to the village sort of structure. Very interesting to think about in my own history, in my own country's history. Our narrative is one that we were a country built on armed struggle, but there's this major component of civil resistance. One thing I remember Gene Sharp telling me once is that there were British governors who were supposed to be running the colonies, who would write back to the Crown and say, I have no power outside my front door, no one listens to me. So then the women's suffrage struggle in this country and in other parts of the world, UK. This is outside the White House. And there was repression visited upon these women. I mean, there was they were sent to insane asylums. They were sent to prison. When they went on hunger strike, they were force-fed just to get the right to vote. in the US. The US labor movement, there was a lot of repression on that. There were also African American unions. This is A. Philip Randolph up here in the flyer with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Then we know of the US Civil Rights Movement. These are some of the students you saw yesterday in the film. There's Diane Nash in the center and Bernard Lafayette. And keep in mind, of course, that at the time, no one knew whether the civil rights movement was going to be effective or not, right? The way that we think of Martin Luther King today is very different than the way people thought of him then. And so here he is getting arrested. Who's this guy getting arrested? Oh, it's Martin Luther King. Oh, he's, who knows? Well, okay, this is frequently what we see. Here's an image of him getting arrested. Here's an image of him meeting with Lyndon Johnson, the president, in the White House. So here it looks like he has no power. And here we see the power of nonviolent political struggle.
Sorry, how many years apart were these two pictures?
That's a good question. I think he's probably meeting with Johnson in what, Mary? Maybe 64, 65?
That was around Selma, March 65.
Yeah. Yeah.
Early 65.
Yeah. And I don't know about the first picture. The United Farm Workers, which is a great case. I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. The anti-Vietnam War movement. The anti-nuclear movement. The plan was to build over 1,000 nuclear power plants in the United States until a movement said, actually, no. There's a lot of corruption and danger in that. ACT UP, raising AIDS awareness. This is a die-in in San Francisco when people didn't want to talk about HIV/AIDS. The immigrant rights movement, which we'll hear more about on Thursday. We have one of the participants in that movement speaking. This is action against the tar sands, basically climate change activists in front of the White House. Occupy Wall Street, which we can debate whether it's a movement or not because how long did it sustain itself or so forth. And then we have, of course, international context. This is Bolivia. This is in Cochabamba, the second largest city in Bolivia. And here, the US corporation Bechtel had been sold water rights for Cochabamba. The second largest city in Bolivia, all their water, all of it, even the rain that fell from the sky, could not be harvested because Bechtel owned it. Exactly. What? So, in Cochabamba, they organized. And they won. And they basically got the entire contract with Bechtel canceled. This is a struggle in Korea against corrupt politicians. These people are holding up red cards, like in a football match, with the word out on it. And so they do this rally, and every time they'd yell the name of a politician who was corrupt on this blacklist, there were people that were trying to vote out, people would go, out! And amazing struggle, which I hope we talk about more in the anti-corruption segment on Thursday. In Serbia, the Otpor movement, started by young people. And we have Ivan here as a veteran and one of the founders of that movement, and gradually growing to include other elements in society to end the rule of Slobodan Milosevic, who had ruled the country for 13 years, started multiple wars, and stolen elections, and assassinated his political opposition. The former Soviet Republic of Georgia in 2003, what became known as the Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine of 2004, mass demonstrations in Lebanon after the assassination of Rafik Hariri, which when you consider the population of Lebanon, getting 1 million people to demonstrate is enormous percentage of that population. Huh?
The fourth or the fifth.
Yeah, right. So here you get 14,000, this uprising, nonviolent uprising, succeeds in getting 14,000 Syrian troops out of Lebanon. This is a movement against the mafia in Sicily. It's called Audio Pizzo. Pizzo in Italian means sort of protection money you would pay organized crime. Businesses had to pay this. This movement, Audio Pizzo, it says goodbye protection money. It says, and here, one of their campaigns was Cambia I consumi, change your consumer habits. So basically stop shopping at businesses that pay Pizzo to the mafia. Only shop at businesses that actually publicly say we don't pay any protection money. Very interesting. This movement was started by several young people who wanted to start a pub, a bar, a restaurant, and decided they would not put Pizzo in their business plan. It would not have an item on the budget. And then they said, well, we have to do something about the problem of Pizzo then, and they built this movement. Zimbabwe, one of the most, really arguably the most effective civil society group there, Women of Zimbabwe Arise. In this picture you have Jenny Williams wearing the green shirt, one of the bravest people I have ever met, really remarkable, and has been to FSI before. Their message of tough love for Mugabe, who needs to be disciplined like a child. And they're the mothers who are going to do it. In Nepal in 2006, you have a long-standing civil war that ultimately comes to an end. The major violent portion of that comes to an end when Maoist insurgents and other groups actually decide they can advance their struggle more through non-violently struggling against the king, King Gyanendra, who had dissolved the parliament and claimed all powers for himself. Very interesting case here of a shift from violent tactics to non-violent tactics. The Iranian women's movement. This is women who have taken over a portion of the stadium in Tehran during a World Cup qualifying match against Bahrain in 2006. So there's international cameras showing. The law is that women are not able to go to football matches. The women start putting slogans on their headscarves, put TVs outside of the stadium and start cheering, and they're rooting for the team. And then at one point, they basically storm the stadium. And interestingly, after this happened, the president at the time was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who said that actually maybe women should be able to attend football matches after this because, and this was his justification, it might improve the conduct of the male spectators. That was his rationale. But it was the pressure of the women that forced this to happen. And ultimately, and full disclosure, this was ultimately put down by the Guardian Council, which vetoed it. But interesting that someone, even as conservative as we think of Ahmadinejad, might say, you know what, I'll accommodate this because I don't want to fight it anymore. In Pakistan in 2007, the lawyers' movement, the US-backed dictator Pervez Musharraf made one of the worst mistakes I think a dictator could make, which is he angered all the lawyers in his country, and by trying to force the Chief Justice to resign. In Burma in 2007, what became known as the Saffron Revolution, which was violently put down. In the West Bank and Palestine, this I believe is the village of Budrus, demonstrating and doing direct nonviolent intervention and civil disobedience against the wall. Here we have a number of people from the village of Bilin, dressed up as the Na'vi people from the film Avatar, doing one of the most famous demonstrations and actions and civil disobedience they did against the wall. In Russia in 2008, these are demonstrators, excuse me, I keep referring to people as demonstrators. They're doing much more than that. These are people who are trying to keep a forest, the Khimki forest outside of Moscow, from being logged. These are environmental activists who, when they realized that this forest was going to be logged for road and development, they later uncovered great corruption in it too. And so it started as an environmental struggle, became an anti-corruption struggle. This is Yevgenia Chirikova, one of the leaders, putting her life on the line. In Iran, what became known as the Green Movement. In Tunisia, of course, we get into the Arab uprising, Arab awakenings. In Yemen, we have a defecting security force here. In Bahrain. In China, we had what came to be known as an attempt to start the, quote, Jasmine Revolution, where, are people familiar with the action going on here? So, yeah. So, Tang, did you want to talk about it or for a second, or should I?
After the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, some people called for the similar Jasmine revolution in China, and there was a tweet on Twitter calling for that kind of gathering. But 2 days before that day, the February 20th of 2011, I and many other human rights lawyers and activists were kidnapped, and then I was detained and tortured for 70 days. But on that, 70 days. But on that day, February 20th, some Chinese, not many, but some Chinese people went there in the main square the main street in Changsha, Wuhan, and Beijing, some big cities to protest, to demonstrate, and more policemen and plain clothes policemen than the protesters.
Yes. And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that a call went out to gather in a very busy place and walk around and simply smile occasionally at people. And that even this, the police showed up in hundreds, saying, who are these people who would show up and smile occasionally at people? Why? Why would they do that? Because they understood that just on principle, if people can find even the smallest action where they can say we're doing this organized outside of the power of the state, where we can find a way to do small acts of creating our own little political space that the state can't control, that simply that basic action was a threat to their power, was a threat to the state. So they send police, and they look ridiculous because how do you figure out who's choosing not to smile for a minute or smiling, right, in a crowded area? And so this leads to the question, of course, of, well, over time, if you think about this small example, if police are having to do this all the time, are they getting paid overtime? How do the police feel about going around trying to find smiling people and so forth? So this happened for a short period of time in China, but if you understand the concept here, very low risk form of action, extreme amount of resources to try to do anything about it that the state has to spend relative to the resources people have to spend to just walk up and smile. Sustained over time puts actually a government in a really big dilemma. In Syria, we often forget that the first 8 months of this struggle were nonviolent. There was increasing violence after August. But I would argue personally that the Assad family's regime in Syria was shaken more in the first 8 months than it was in the years afterwards. You could argue maybe now, okay, maybe it's more tenuous now, maybe not. You'd have to look at the cost right now of what's gone on. And even now you could argue Assad is still quite in control. I would argue it was much weaker in the early months of 2011. In Spain, we have Indignados in 2011, and a lot of these actions, I'm sort of assigning a year to it, but a lot of these actions have gone on to create other kinds of campaigns, other kinds of movements. They're not just a 1 year, they continue on. And in Spain we've seen this, in Russia against stolen elections, Sudan, the Maldives Islands, Ukraine, Hong Kong. And here I had to highlight a campaign by my colleague Philippe Duhamel, who he can talk about it, against fracking, basically drilling deep in the ground for hydrocarbons and extreme energy in Quebec. And he can tell you more about this campaign if you ask him. It's brilliant. So these are just some examples. Now, my colleague Erica Chenoweth over there, who you'll meet, who we're really lucky to have, keeps track of a lot of campaigns and movements around the world. And according to Erica's data, there have been more civil resistance movements challenging governments. They have to meet her criteria to be counted. We can get into those criteria later if you want. There are more between 2010 and 2013 than there were for the entire decade of 1990 to 2000. So just from 2010 to 2013, the number is increasing a lot. At the same time, effectiveness actually seems to be going down somewhat, and we'll get into that later. But what we can say, and it echoes what I said yesterday, is if we want to understand the world today, if we say we want to understand the world, we have to understand this kind of power because it's increasing and it's everywhere. So conceptually, how do we understand this? We can look at the traditional view of power. We can look at the traditional view of power first and say, well, movements should not be able to succeed because power really comes from the top down. Elites and elite organizations are inherently powerful. They basically can make rules, impose their law, impose their rules on people underneath. The power structure doesn't change. So in traditional view of political power, how do you get a change? The guy in power dies, or you do a coup, and you try to get your person on top of the pyramid, or you do violent insurgency and try to get your person on top of the pyramid. And of course, then you just hope that whoever took over in a coup or the violent insurgents suddenly really are Democrats in disguise, and then decide, you know what, this chair really isn't that comfortable, I'd like to give it over to civilian control. And we know that doesn't happen very often. So in this traditional view, power comes from the control of resources, information, the capacity to commit violence, and it's top-down. And so when that's the view, what this guy says is from this podium is really important, right? And the theoretical basis for understanding movements is actually the opposite. It's that power comes from consent and obedience. Power resides among all people. So if students don't show up to school, if people don't buy, if truckers stop shipping things through trucks and trains, if ports close, if planes don't fly, if engineers don't repair infrastructure, if builders don't build buildings, if people don't choose to raise their kids in a certain way or choose not to teach them a certain way in the classroom, if workers don't work or work slow or inefficiently and so forth, actually society can't function. They can come to a standstill very, very fast. Very, very fast. Now, many of these people you would say, well, they're just going to work. They're just buying food. They're just doing the things they need to do to survive. And yet we know that when you accumulate all those millions of acts of micro-obedience, micro-consent every day, what you get is something called the status quo. And if you're unhappy with the status quo, and if elections and the legal system and negotiations and all these other ways of trying to influence the status quo are not enough, then this shifting of obedience becomes something that people feel is a necessity. And then the question that I would like to emphasize is really that then it's a contest where you have power holders at the top who have certain capacities at their disposal, you have ordinary people who have certain capacities at their disposal, and it's a contest where strategy really matters, where organization really matters, where discipline really matters. Now, this is, again, a broad conceptual view. Every situation's different. Situation in Palestine, of course, is very different from another country. In Palestine, you're looking at an anti-occupation struggle, which is different than an anti-dictatorship struggle, and so forth. There are very big differences that are important and we can get into. And so if you look in an occupation context, you generally will need allies outside of that context, because even if all the people under occupation withdraw consent, that still might not be enough to change things. But in many cases, it is. And even in cases of occupation, what I would argue is that for external actors to start to shift their consent, the population under occupation also needs to shift their consent first as an example, as something to show, we're doing this, please support us. So this issue of shifting consent and then finding a way to do it with strategy and organization and unity and discipline is a big part of what this week is about. It's thinking through this both from a practical as well as a theoretical and research-based perspective. So this view of power is what Sharp called the pluralistic view of power, that power comes from consent. And with this view, actually, you could sort of conceive of actually a society not even running as a triangle with one person on top. You can sort of shape it as you want. It's not the triangle isn't necessarily fixed, but I don't have a slide for that. Maybe I should add one. And so when you look at this, then this mass of people becomes very important. Now we can get later into how do you even know if this is a mass of people or a movement? Is this just like a crowd who just showed up or a movement? We can get into that later. And we also, I'm using a tough example in Egypt because we know the transition in Egypt has been extremely difficult. And we're going to watch a whole film on that tonight. So I'm not trying to overpromise. I'm not saying, hey, everything's going to be great. What I'm saying is there's a form of power here that can be used, that is used, and let's get actually to the data about just how effective it is. So my organization for a long time has been making this argument that nonviolent power is much more effective than most people think. And in 2006, we had the good fortune of meeting Dr. Erica Chenoweth over there, who was willing to allow us to support her research into looking at how this really works. If we do the data, if we take statistics and really look at the success rate of nonviolent, she used the term campaigns, I use movement, but we'll use campaigns to be consistent with the research, nonviolent campaigns, and violent campaigns. Let's take the data, let's count as many as we can from 1900 to at that point 2006, and let's look at effectiveness. And so that's what Erica did with our colleague Maria Stephan, and they published a book which you all will get a copy of, I believe, called Why Civil Resistance Works in 2011. And what they did is they looked at campaigns that were challenging governments. So they tried to only look at, quote, the hard cases. They didn't look at a small anti-corruption struggle or a small anti-environmental struggle, which can also be very hard, because it's very difficult to count those in social science all the same way. They tried to figure, okay, we need something we can count. We can count campaigns against governments. Now, what kinds of campaigns? Campaigns that are trying to change a government, campaigns that are trying to secede from a country, or campaigns that are trying to get self-determination. So what we would call maximalist objectives, really hard objectives. And they counted 323 violent and nonviolent campaigns over about a century. Now, what do you think the success rate of the nonviolent campaigns was in achieving their objectives of changing government, seceding, or so forth? If you know the answer, don't comment. If you don't know the answer, comment. Take a guess. 65% success, okay.
I just wanted to clarify, are we talking about all sorts of movements or the hard ones that you mentioned?
Just the hard ones that because they were taking statistics, they had to find standard things that they could count. So that's the unit they chose to count, is that kind of a hard movement. 50. 20%. 5%. Let's 100%. Wow. Okay. Here's the finding over that century. Yes. Good guess. Very good guess. Now, this is, of course, just one study. And you could look at other studies. Or actually, there are no other studies on this particular thing. But you could say, well, it's just one study. How do I know? And, I mean, of course, you're welcome to talk to the researcher over there. I encourage you to read the book. And I would also point something out. I like to point this out. So the American Political Science Association is a large academic entity dealing with political science in the US. Not necessarily a group that is going to really easily give an award to a book that challenges assumptions about the role of the state and violence and so forth. And certainly a group that would look very, very critically at research methodology to find any kind of small issues in terms of how they researched it, why it's not valid. They gave it their Book of the Year award for best book of 2011. It's won other awards too, but that one in particular, you wouldn't think of American Political Science Association being like, look at this book saying nonviolent movements work as a logical candidate. They gave it Book of the Year. Yes?
I'm wondering, some of that would include this secession sort of movements from like a state. Like
Correct. So,
and in this success rate, like 26%, I mean, what is the methodology? How do you consider this a success if like a state that has seceded has been established and recognized?
correct.
Or if like self-determined territory.
If they get some autonomy, it would be a partial success. Erica will correct me if I'm wrong, if they get full independence. And if you break it down, it's a good question, into self-determination, foreign occupation, and anti-dictatorship, in self-determination, it was a third. It was only, I think it was only 33% effectiveness, if I'm correct. So what I just shared with you was total numbers. The majority of these were anti-dictatorship. The success rate of anti-dictatorship, I think, was 57 or 59%. Self-determination was a much smaller group of cases, and there it was 30%, so 33%. However, in self-determination, I have to point out as well, armed strategies had a 33% chance too. But it was a much smaller data set, so it's hard to draw really big conclusions from such a small group of cases. But on the other hand, if we think about, well, why would nonviolent strategies work at all in self-determination cases? It's pretty amazing they worked a third of the time. And there's one other point I'll make to you next, because I am biased. I do think nonviolent strategies generally tend to work better based on the data and also based on long-term outcomes, which we'll get to in a second. So here is a breakdown graphically of those results I just shared with you. And here is success rate over time. So we can see in the 40s and 50s, there weren't a lot of cases during those decades that were in the data set, but those cases, you could make an argument that violent and nonviolent strategies were about equally effective, and then we see a real divergence. And I don't have the data to extend this graph yet, but Erica does, and I will say that in recent decades, this graph has gone down. We're looking now at success rates for nonviolent movements that are more akin to 30 to 40%. It's gone down a lot in recent years. The success rate of violent campaigns has gone down even more. So actually, on the whole, you'd say, well, nonviolent campaigns are twice as effective as violent campaigns. If you look at recent decades, actually like 3 or 4 times more effective. But the absolute success rate of civil resistance campaigns has gone down. And then the question is why? We can make different arguments. One, you could say, well, we don't know if it's a trend yet because it's recent. It could be regression to the mean. Like things got so high, 2000 to 2006, that bar goes actually up further than even that 60%. Maybe it's just normal that they would regress. We could also say a lot more people are trying civil resistance right now because they recognize it's powerful, but they're not necessarily doing the kind of strategizing that it needs to be as effective as it can. They saw it work somewhere, they want to try it, and they're not necessarily doing a lot of the research to make sure that it's effective. You could also make the argument that governments are getting much better at dealing with civil resistance movements. I think you can make a very strong argument with lots of specific examples of that. But if we look at this as a contest, what I would hypothesize is that we're going to see coevolution. Governments or others get better at dealing with movements. Movements adapt their tactics accordingly, find new tactics, new strategies that are more effective. Then the success rate goes up. Governments find new ways, or corporations. And so my guess is that over time, we will see rising and falling with different tactics and strategies tried by both sides. But we'll see. We'll see. Now, the record after a nonviolent movement has been successful is also very important to point out. And I have 2 studies I can draw on from this. The first, of course, is Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffens. And they looked 5 years after a nonviolent campaign and a violent campaign achieved its objectives. And here is the likelihood of a democratic outcome 5 years after a campaign has succeeded. This one here on the left. 57% chance of a democratic outcome for nonviolent campaigns and 6% for violent campaigns 5 years after success. And this is why I said earlier I was biased. I don't give advice to people about what form of struggle they should do. I don't want to get into whether people have a right to self-defense or so forth, but I'm biased because I've seen the data. And even if you look at even if you say, well, in self-determination, what's more effective, it's a third based on their data, look at long-term outcomes. And it's pretty compelling. And then what I find is one of the most interesting findings here, failed campaigns. 5 years after a nonviolent campaign fails, there's still a 35% chance of a democratic outcome. Whereas with violence, I think it's at 4%. So what's going on there? I'm going to stop talking in a second, so maybe we can get into that. But I will say, very interesting to think about this kind of effect that a movement has even if it fails. And I would argue that it decentralizes power in society by getting lots of people to participate, which is sort of, it's an incubator for democratic change, even if it doesn't achieve its stated goal. We have one other study, which was an earlier study called How Freedom is Won, From Civic Resistance to Durable Democracy. It is available online for free download. And this looked at a smaller set of cases, but I'll point it out. It looked at 67 transitions over a 33-year period, 1970 to 2005. These were authoritarian governments or non-democratic governments where there was a transition. Some of them became authoritarian again after the transition. Some of them became semi-democratic. Some of them became fully democratic. What they found first is that in 75% of the transitions they identified in this 30-year time period, nonviolent civic resistance was, quote, a key factor. And you can, again, download the study, look at their definition of that if you want. The second is that were transitions that were led by nonviolent civic resistance led to greater increases in freedom, like vastly greater increases in freedom. So about 2/3 of the time they led to a very free society, which is consistent with the study we just looked at. In contrast, if you look at top-down transitions, transitions that are where it's trying to end a war and so get the leaders together, come up with an agreement, or elites just decide we're going to try to do a democratic transition, there was a democratic outcome. Actually, this slide is wrong. It says 3 out of 14 times. It's actually 2 out of 14 times. So that's about let's see, that's about 14 or 15% of the time for top-down transitions without any kind of grassroots input. Led to a democratic outcome 14, 15% of the time. And then don't worry about the bottom 3 bullet points. I'll just summarize for you. They also found that when violence was used against movements, it did not decrease the chance of a democratic outcome significantly. But when movements used violence back against the state, it dropped the chances of a democratic outcome to about 20%. So violence by itself doesn't drop the chance of a democratic outcome. It's violence by the movement that drops it very significantly. Was a finding there. So here's another graph pointing it out. We see here blue is nonviolent transitions, democratic outcomes above 60. Red is top-down initiatives you see often resulting in sort of partial democratic transitions. And then when movements use violence, you look at the yellow-green, and you see high chance of a non-democratic outcome. I think I'll stop there. Why don't we, I won't do the next study, the next slide, and we'll stop there. So we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, Daniel.